How are you? Like, what's up?
Um, I'm doing all right. I've kind of just been relaxing a little bit. Was trying. Well, I was supposed to get some reading in, but I kind of procrastinated on that. But other than that, I'm doing good.
All right, great. So, what do you want to talk about? The neopronouns thing. Like, what do you got?
Oh, I guess I had like a bunch of things to talk about. I guess because I don't know. Uh, I kind of forgot about how what the conversation was that kind of triggered it, but I guess I don't know where to start exactly. I guess that's the thing. Um, but I guess because we don't really disagree on much, right? We would both say neopronouns are pretty valid, relevant, and sound. But
Yeah.
shoot. Um, yeah, but I guess I don't know. I had like an argument kind of written out. But I don't know if that's like something you would want to hear or anything like that.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I was planning on talking about. So,
Okay. So I guess the idea is like I kind of chopped it up into four parts. There's like there was like a grammatical premise, a logical premise, blah, and then like two sort of conclusions. Um, and I guess the general idea and the most foundational aspect of like neopronouns being relevant in whatever culture you might find or language that you might find, provided that they use like a noun pronoun system, is like that. Well, the the pronoun is something that kind of replaces the noun or the proper noun. Um, that is to say, like it it allows you to kind of replace it with your name, or for instance, like the title man or something like that. Um, and I think that was like a key element in the discussion that you guys were having before because there seemed to be like a struggle on differentiating the pronoun from something like a name, at least on one side, from what I could tell.
yeah. Like, what is the difference between that and a name? Like, he was using that as an
Hmm.
excuse to just call the person just their name and not use their pronouns, basically. Like,
Yeah,
I was trying
and
to
that was like
explain like it's a different kind of word. Like it's the difference is it's not their name. Like what do you mean? What's the
mhm.
difference? Like
Yeah, and like the thing that's at least similar between nouns and pronouns is that they kind of their job is quite literally to replace the name. Um it's to be a use that is I guess a counterpart of the name would probably be a proper way of phrasing it. Um but um Oh yeah, that was kind of like the one most simple and like basic aspect of why it wasn't a name, or for instance, why it has like a valid place in language. I think is a better way to pose that.
yeah.
The other sort of thing was kind of like how it's. I say the logical premise, but it's kind of more, I guess, teleological or based on how we use the pronoun, like in a more, let's say, cultural or evident kind of way. Um, and it was something that struck me as the most curious thing about a pronoun because there when we acknowledge that pronouns are separate from gender, right? Um, we kind of acknowledge that there isn't exactly an idea of the he or the she or like the generic he him. or she, her. You know what I'm saying? Like, whenever we use she, her, or he, him, they are referring usually to a particular person or at least one person.
Yeah.
Um, and in, yeah, and so like I guess the way that I would like kind of logically separate it from being a name, but also from being like a title to a demographic or a category of human beings is like it is what was the phrasing I used? I said it that the name is something that's personal, but the pronoun is realistically or is in comparison at least impersonal. Um and then in comparison to, for instance, like a title or like saying I'm an African American or I'm a woman, it would be like I used a very specific name that it wasn't generic. That it was that simple. That it doesn't have a generic form. It's almost always particular, or we kind of use it in this nominalist way. Um, uh, and that's kind of what that part of it was. Because when I don't know, when you expect a whole community to be like, or when you expect he him to represent a demographic, you don't get a very um you get a very useless demographic out of doing that,
I was
in
trying
my
to
opinion.
explain that to him because he was making the opposite argument. He was saying
Hmm.
like, I can tell you what a he him looks like like he literally
Yeah.
he's being that like normative and conventional about gender. Like he has all these kind of conflationary conceptions of it where he literally made the argument of like, oh, a man is someone who has like short hair and is like taller and like stronger and like even specified the genitals. Like he literally made that argument, and I didn't expect that. Like I didn't, I
Mhm.
didn't expect him to go that low. Like,
Yeah. And like that was something I found really crazy. Like it was hard for me to grab onto anything to it to when it came to that because it when he I guess when he deploys that argument, it's dealing with such a like intentionally delimiting epistemology. like he intentionally limits his uh I guess perspective on language, like not even gender, just language. Um and on top of that he conflates pronouns and the way that we use them within language with gender, which becomes a major cultural problem once you start doing that, and becomes very it becomes inconsistent when you start saying stuff like pronouns and gender are the same thing, and pronouns and gender happen to be like a cultural cornerstone, or the binary of gender is a cultural cornerstone in like Western culture, and that becomes like so it's like okay, so if gender is pronouns, then there there realistically cannot be a limit to like to gender or pronouns because I don't know, like because there's that relationship between sex, between gender, and between pronouns, right? Like there are those three
yeah,
objects,
but like
and
he was like, I just wanted to explain somehow to him and get it across, even though it seemed like impossible to do this because he would never see
yeah,
it in this perspective. That he was just being like a cultural cop, like he was just being like
mhm,
the representative of a certain conception of things, and just acting like that was an ontological fact. Like he was
mhm,
literally making it out as if things that are culturally and like historically contingent are just factual things that you can assert as true.
mhm. Which was it's so interesting, but I think it comes from a place where um you're kind of taught in certain classes, maybe like this is from a personal experience of mine, like you're taught kind of prima facie that like gender and pronouns are inherently social as a means to be like counter toward the idea of gender being like a biological thing or something like that. But if you take that like to such a serious degree that you kind of put it on this ontological pedestal that culture is now some sort of foundation to how people experience their lives, I guess. Like you start getting a bunch of problems there, and you start looking quite authoritarian in how you define people's experiences. So yeah, I 100% agree with that too. Like it's just yeah,
Yeah,
it's silly right there.
he was making demands cloaked as if they were truisms. Like that, and I
Yeah.
didn't know how to express that to him. But yeah, this guy Arminius in the chat. If you don't care about this
Mhm.
topic, then just leave. Like you might want to skip this particular stream. Uh, but
Yeah.
yeah, like I didn't know how to get this across to him because he wasn't even. I don't know if you noticed this, but it seems like he wasn't even taking my argument seriously. Like he was just kind of bulldozing
Yeah.
through.
The whole time I was listening, it seemed like you guys were in some fashion he was talking past you because his arguments were simply like impossible to um impossible to interpret anything like external to it. And then the only reason you were talking past him was because his arguments were in a very ontological sense impenetrable. They were kind of they were so slippery that you can't insert something to cause it to fall apart or realize something um as like a, I guess, conceptual or visual analogy. um but yeah, then it's like there becomes all of these like then it becomes we get into a bunch of cultural problems with like his argument, but also just in general, like the general consensus on how some people feel about pronouns when they're against it. It's like how did it go? um oh, I think shoot. Oh, sorry, my phone's going off. um uh Yeah. So, like, the thing about neopronouns, and I think this is like the more obvious part of the conclusion regarding defending neopronouns and separating them from pronouns, for instance, is that they are like it's implicit that they are a new type of pronoun, like
Yeah.
which we could just take to mean from the original assumption that they are a new way to replace the noun in proper noun, um, which is to say, so long as it is a kind of noun that isn't like a generic noun or a proper noun, then it functions efficiently as some sort of pronoun, so long as you're using it as a pronoun. And it's not hard to use any non-generic or non proper noun in replacement for a, for those types of nouns. So I think the example that I gave was like there in the Latin language there are certain like accusative words that you can use on a person that can effectively uh, like replace a proper noun or a noun. And it's essentially just like I think an example. One of my neopronouns is affectus, which means someone who affects someone, like with an a. Um, and there's a deeper meaning to it for me personally, obviously, but it functions in language, or at least the English language, as a neopronoun. And it's not necessarily a regular pronoun because it's like it it isn't the way that we would consider it to be, like he him or they them, or she her, like because those nouns are in their own way they are that's a good question. Shoot, they're just a different kind of noun, I guess is the best way to put it. I haven't really thought about that point well enough, but there's something to it. Um,
That's interesting. Yeah.
but like, yeah, like I think the way to defend neopronouns is definitely just like go back to the grammatical roots, and you'll find that like this thing is beyond um more valid than most people tend to believe, even those who tend to defend it. Like I myself find I find myself surprised every time I come back to writing more nuanced defense, more nuanced and detailed defenses of neopronouns, because opinion, and I think that's the same exact problem that you were facing with your argument with that other guy. Um, because that's that's fundamentally what his argument boiled down to, is his opinion about not only Western culture but what a pronoun ultimately should be. But neopronouns don't break the grammatical rule me in a lot of ways. But yeah, like
Wait, can you say that again? You're kind of breaking up here. The neopronouns don't break the grammatical.
oh I'm sorry, I'm lagging.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let me hold on. 1 second.
All right. Dude, Armenius in the chat. I do not oppose Muslims. And I like you're just putting this on me, attributing views to me I don't have, and you're being a dumbass in the chat. So just chill and leave if you don't care about the topic. That's all I said. You don't have to be an idiot.
Sorry about that. It's kind of like windy as hell where I am at, so like I'll have some breakup, or I'll be breaking up with my internet. Oh shit.
Are we back?
I think I think I'm back.
Okay.
Um I think I had to close my view of the stream because it was interfering a bit. Oh no. Um oh,
Oh, damn it. Hopefully this works.
I think that does work a little bit more.
Okay. So you were saying neopronouns don't break the grammatical something.
Oh, that's right. So like I think a simple way of putting it is like neopronouns, they don't break or limit the role of pronouns or the grammatical, or actually, oh no, the more precise way I put it was neopronouns do not break the rules of like what a pronoun should do. Um, they only expand upon the freedoms that you have when utilizing like the role of a pronoun. Um, so quite literally, you are just you're giving yourself more options of words or entirely new words in some cases, to replace your name, or in some cases the title that is given to your gender. um, it's a form of expressing yourself more freely, um, and that's kind of what covers the entire half of like more, or one entire half of the arguments you guys are dealing with.
Yeah. So basically, like, it doesn't actually like it functions as a pronoun, but it also has more functions. So like, there's no reason to just default to using the person's
Mhm.
name because it's still it doesn't actually break the grammatical structure
Mhm.
that it would normally fit into. But how would you answer the point that he was making where he was basically saying like gender to me is just like I mean he was basically saying it's just the binary and he was incapable of
Yeah.
conceiving literally incapable of even imagining the possibility of like a
Of even
gender
like a
that
third gender.
wasn't male or female, yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think that what that fundamentally dealt with was like some kind of um logically speaking, I would call that like a domain error, where he's dealing with like uh, uh where he's dealing with the inability to parse the members or sub or objects of the domain that he has set for himself. Um, and the only way that he can parse it is in two categories, right? Um, but like a key talking point within the LGBT community, that's it's really simple, and they always try to hammer it in, is that gender is a very dynamic and fluid concept fundamentally. And the reason they don't say this for no simple reason, right? They don't say this because people claim to have more than two genders, more than a binary with the genders. Um, they claim this because um, traits that you would consider fundamental to being a woman, or traits that you would consider fundamental to being a man, could still technically be traits that are fundamental to being this third gender, or in some cases they could be fundamental to your own experience if you were a gender. um, in every single case in which you are dealing with a gender that is outside of the binary, or I guess between the two poles of the binary, if you want to be like gender fluid or something like that, um, no matter what, you are going to be dealing with real objects that are in the world. It's not a matter of saying, oh, there are objects outside of the world that somehow define a third gender, which I think is kind of how he was trying to approach it. It's more like there are different ways to interpret the traits that we often associate with gender, and sometimes the traits that we don't associate with gender,
Yeah, he was
including
defining it
genders.
out of existence, literally.
Yeah,
And he was like
which is
basically saying like I won't budge from this worldview. Like that's why it was so
yeah.
impossible to argue with because it was just a contradiction of worldviews. Like
Mhm. You can't have something that transcends existence. I don't think anyone would admit to that sort of thing. So when you hold somebody to an impossible standard like that, you can't really get them to budge. Um, or yeah, you or rather, when you hold someone to an impossible standard, it is hard to get you to budge. Is
yeah.
the right way for me to phrase it. Um, Yeah, it's an ontological problem fundamentally. Um and um how would I even respond to it? Because like that's just like showing the problem as it is. But responding to it is an entirely different question, and it's honestly harder to do. Um because you have to find a way to get them to realize their committing to that problem. Um, and to that, I guess I would just say is like the only way to really show that is to get someone to understand that fundamentally gender is something that you yeah, gender is an assumed kind of status. So like in some cases people will assume it about another person, but in the way that like trans rhetoric and rhetoric that we would use would be like we assume it for ourselves. Um that is to say, like, there is no, I guess, the generic gender, or I guess what is universal to all gender is that we assume it about someone else or we assume it about ourselves. Generally, that it is just assumed. So what he is doing is assuming these two genders and not giving charity to assume the other kinds of genders. Um,
Right.
because it is, I guess the philosophical term is that it is ontologically simple or basic. I think ontologically basic is the professional term. You cannot define it. You can't define anything that precedes it because it is a given.
Yeah, and he just I'm trying to think of like how he would respond to these points. It's just like I was thinking of something earlier, like he just defaults back to, oh well, this is how we see it. Like,
Mm. Yeah.
it's like, what does that even mean? Like, who the fuck is we? Like, he's just
Yeah, who is we? I hope you're not including me in we. Like, and I think
right.
you said that multiple times too. Um, which was really funny. Like, I don't know, man. The whole reason why I was like riled up to talk about this is because it was so frustrating to see it happen, like to see it like happen in circles so many times. Because it was like it's something we understand in philosophy is like such a like basic problem when you run into it. But when like I think he mentioned that he wanted to work it out in layman terms and in a layman way, and it can be really hard to describe that like that. It's not even circular. It's just like um the assertion of an opinion as something more than an opinion. Um, it's hard to describe that problem to someone um, when they want it in layman terms, I guess. At least it is for me. Uh,
Yeah, well, I think what he meant when he said that was like, because he is a liberal, like politically, and he has the worldview
mhm.
of like we need to trust the experts in all of the fields. Like he has this, I call it the servile philosophical mentality, where people
Mhm.
kind of operate only within the assumption that they, as individual subjects, cannot hold truth or factual information on their own. They always have to defer to some kind of external source of knowledge and say like,
Right.
oh well, like scientifically, or like, like this is what the institutions are telling us, you know what I mean? Like this is what the consensus is. Like people who just operate only upon those terms. So I
Mhm.
think what he was kind of saying when he said like we're just laymen was like, well, we aren't like the philosopher kings. Like we don't have the big like, like we don't
Yeah.
have the power basically to. And then I was trying
And
to describe to him like, actually we do. Like you are
mhm.
exerting power. You are reifying this particular like assumption of power just by saying this and adopting this worldview. Like that's all you're doing. And then he was like, well, I
Right.
wouldn't give myself that much credit. Like,
Yeah, and what he like, I guess what he wasn't seeing is that he definitely was doing that, and I guess he thought he was working on assumptions that the quote unquote professionals always would when associating themselves with the quote unquote layman. Um, where it's like, I'm going to deny this sort of thing until proven otherwise, because that to him doesn't appear as like the assertion of some presence or truth or like positive object of any kind. Um, he but that is like such an interesting image though, like the servile, like philosophical view, like that whole image is really fascinating, I guess, from like the little I know about Kant when contrasting it to him. It's like very fascinating because then they like that's how they comfort themselves when it comes to the concept of truth, because it's not an easy thing to arrive at like some sort of truth. So they kind of fashion themselves a pseudo um transcendental analytic, um where some human being outside of their own understanding asserts it for them, instead of like what Kant would have envisioned to be like, I guess, something much more abstract but nonetheless external to his experience. um
Yeah, for sure. It's like he doesn't recognize culture as something that is actively maintained and created by people. Like on an
yeah,
everyday level, he just thinks that culture is like something that is handed down to us, that like presides over us, that we have to like obey the terms of.
it's something that we're constantly working on, like it's something that would fall apart if we weren't constantly working on, like what we're doing is like filling the cracks with gold, to give it like to give it a metaphor. It's like um we yeah, like I mentioned it in chat, and when he responded it was like weird, like when I said we're creating new culture, I didn't mean we are creating a new culture like some sort of distant or separate culture. I meant we are creating like new objects of culture or tools of culture, um, and ways to interact with the world and each other. Like that doesn't necessarily mean that it is separate from Western culture or transcends Western culture, but I mentioned this in like the little script I wrote myself. It was like when we do create these new cultural tools, we aren't transcending the tradition of culture. We are actually grounding it in the world. It's the opposite function that we tend to associate it with, is like descent from something like descent from, I guess, for example, the capitalist, right? Like finding ways to rebel against the capitalist, or kind of dethrone or depopulate the capitalist from this world, is the sort of action that grounds the quote unquote capitalist in the world. That is to say, like, I guess a more colloquial analogy is to say that like the things that we ground when creating these new tools are people that have their heads in the clouds, or that have some sort of delusion about them that simply doesn't fit, but they make it fit in the same exact way that he was arguing, like in the same exact way that he was trying to put his worldview forward, by forcing this binary on everyone.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, that's a good way of breaking that down.
Sorry, like I go on like these long-winded tangents. I'm really sorry about that.
It's fine. Like that's interesting. Um, but yeah, I did not expect him to come out with that kind of perspective on it, because I thought he
Yeah,
was more progressive than this. Like,
it's just like, and that tends to be the thing with people who are like, oh yeah, I'm like liberal, but like they only have their toes in like the progressive like sauce, I guess. I don't even know how else to put it. It's
yeah,
just it's always disappointing every time.
and he like, I don't want to talk too much shit about him, but like, he politically he's very limited. Like he has a lot of limitations. It's not just philosophically. Like he kind of just views politics as like strictly just electoral politics, because he thinks that that's like realistic. So he's
Right.
literally just like a Democrat and nothing else. Like just a liberal Democrat. Even though he has the like he's seen that you can be like outside of that and like have your own kind of ideological quote unquote perspective that's like not just like,
Right.
oh, I'm pro capitalism and like in liberal democracy and all this stuff. He just rejects all that, and now he's just kind of back to where he started. I don't know, it's weird.
Yeah, like something I always say about like I guess American politics, particularly when you associate yourself to the parties, is just like American politics isn't even real liberalism or real conservatism. It's just like kind of a puppet show or an attempt at pretending to be them, if that makes any sense. It's like they're 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 the whole kind of parliament, everything that we have when it comes to political officials and experts, quote unquote, um, they are all kind of neoliberal, or they join hands in their neoliberal like temperament in that they are stalling the entire time. Like their politics are a politics of stalling. And you'll notice this when you contrast it to most other European countries where the conflicts seem a bit more like not too different, but a bit more let's say relevant to like the things that they are attempting to legislate. Like there appears to be more of an effect half of the time, or at least more of the time than in the United States. um Historically speaking, I've always noticed this lame pattern where the liberal will legislate something and the conservative will take that down and legislate something, and it becomes this like Ouroboros of like building and tearing down. um because that's just kind of what it's built on. Like they aren't real checks and balances, they're simply balances, um and
Yeah,
in a
people don't.
completely negative sense.
Yeah, and even in like the kinds of settings that I'm in where we're like discussing political philosophy and like analyzing this kind of thing, people don't even want to criticize it that much. Like they don't want to adopt
Right.
a critical perspective on the like even on a philosophical level. They just kind of want to like
Mhm.
feel okay with the way that it is cuz
Yeah,
they've
exactly.
completely given up on systemic changes. Like I literally had a kid ask me like, "Okay, well how are you going to change the system?" Like so people just want to whine basically. Like these
Mhm.
intellectuals, they just want to whine and like not
Yeah, like
do anything even on a intellectual level to actually like figure it out and like
yeah,
do something
cuz like
new.
yeah, from my experience it's like when most people are faced with like a criticism that doesn't immediately have a solution associated with it, they'll just give up. um they, they won't they'll pretend that the criticism doesn't exist a lot of the time. Like with regard to like and this is kind of like a pop culture, what this is a pop culture reference, but I was seeing like on the internet how so many people were like, I just want to talk about Squid Game, I don't want to talk about how it's like a capitalist critique or like allegory on capitalism or whatever. When like the entire point of that show happens to be like capitalism in South Korea and how damaging it is to families and individuals in that country who are like living um, in an awful financial setting, and all of like like and people just they simply don't want to see that in the show. They'd rather somehow consume it without understanding the critique itself,
It's so crazy.
which is like yeah, it's fascinating. Um, like, and it's like it really is just because um, the world has been, yeah, the world has been stripped of its tools to imagine new solutions to such wide and massive problems. Um, so much so that you'll see people who have similar politics to you, maybe you and I, and you'll see them kind of advocate more often for very primitive and like usually unthinking solutions to these massive problems where it's like as simple as just let's kill all the capitalists or something like that.
Yeah, or like
And
their whole worldview just boils down to like, oh, we just all need to be poor squatters,
yeah,
and we should just do violence, like, and just destroy everything, like.
right. Like the fundamental issue remains that we have like and especially in America we have like an education that deals more often with rote memorization and standardized tests and
Yeah,
preparing you to work in a factory instead of like critical thinking and observing literature and interpreting things creatively. Um,
true. That's how you get these people who they just box in a definitional like sector for a
mhm.
concept or a thing, and they're just like, oh, if it doesn't fit this box, then it doesn't count as that. Like,
Yeah,
as if the world is not
exactly.
a fluid, dynamic place. Like, as if reality is actually made of these clean cut categories. Like, it's so
Mhm.
cringe to me. That's like the
Yeah,
plague of thinking right now. Like,
I,
that's one of
I
them.
I agree 100%. I think it's the plague of thinking right now. When you take a like I was looking at or I am looking at this like discourse that pops up every once in a while on philosophy Twitter that talks about how um analytic philosophy or I guess academic philosophy in general has many neoliberal aspects embedded into it, and it has this kind of economic thinking about it. This sort of we need to produce results and create a sort of profit from our work and all of that, like publish or perish and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But like my sort of retort to that is like fundamentally speaking, it is the analytic tradition that like upholds this exact plague of thinking because that is like literally their mode of like philosophical method is to isolate definitions and figure out or to yes in a sense not to isolate definitions but really to isolate concepts under a explicitly logical domain, oh,
Mm-hmm.
which does make it fundamentally like or at least in support of capitalist mechanisms like something that produces a result that is this sort of American pragmatist ideal, um, where you get something out of it that you can use, but realistically you can't use it. Yeah, but the idea is just that analytic philosophy is so embedded into education. I personally believe, so much so that it finds itself distilling into the method of secondary school and um, how they want to get these kids to think in the first place. They want to get them to think into boxes that are static and binaries and things that don't function on something like a dynamic continuum or to be with Deleuze like in a rhizomatic way.
Yeah.
Um, when like yeah, like there are all these ways to think logically. Like, how do you think these historians tend to argue about like the nature of past and what makes good historical literature? Um, it's something that they have to hash and rehash over and over again, almost as though they were like continental philosophers or in some cases like phenomenologists. Um, it's not something that they do with this cut and dry Aristotelian logic that isolates categories and creates relationships that are most of the time kind of arbitrary. Um, I'm that is a big tangent I'm going on. But yeah, I always think it's like it's education that is always the problem with people who have these. these ideological boxes and these very unthinking solutions to systemic issues, when systemic issues are three-headed hydras. You cut one down and another's like it's going to grow back. um you have to have some sort of concise and um very particular strategy, and it has to work once. Like it can't happen again, because if we're especially if we're facing capitalism, it's the sort of thing that just will appropriate whatever solution you found against it and use it against you with a generation in time. Um, and
True.
to take that even further back to the neopronouns and the categories of that, is just the the way that I boil it down when it comes to people who have attitudes about neopronouns like that is like, these are ideologies of gender. Like you're politicizing gender in a way that is completely unnecessary and does harm to more people than it needs to. Um, and generally, I think it is the goal. I think it should be the goal of the trans community to try and like depoliticize gender and kind of create less of a power dynamic between the genders, as well as any sort of power dynamic upon gender or within gender. Um, I think I actually think like there are a lot of things that like leftists in general have to try and like remove the politics from, because I think it's just that it's just the fact that any competitive attitude feeds back into capitalism, or even colonialism, or any attitude that simply exploits people and
Well, that's
harms people.
interesting that you say that because, like, I forgot the specifics of this, but basically, the like there are certain identities that have become like considered adequate by capital for it to pander to. And so
Mhm.
you have other people who have like these other genders and other ways of conceiving of themselves and experiencing themselves in the world and subjectivizing themselves that capital
Mhm.
hasn't really captured to pander to yet. Like there's not really a market for that because
Yeah.
it's not a label that they have on you.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like you've become imperceptible if you are like a deer gender, like you know what I mean? Like you aren't
Yeah.
they aren't really
You
like
that's
selling you things
It's
like they are
so
to women.
fascinating when you put it that way. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like
And then you
it's not
have the
something that you
liberals who are against those
Mhm.
genders. I wonder why that could be. Like
Yeah, like because you can't have some sort of like, because in their mind having a physical grasp on something that is social is to have an economic grasp on it. It is to quite literally buy it with your money or your capital, or have some sort of investment in it that is delusionally physical. It's not even truly physical. Um,
yeah, it's
and oh my
abstract.
god,
It's really more abstract than it is
yeah,
physical.
yeah. But they like I think that's always the fascinating thing about both neoliberals and specifically the neoclassical economics is they are so convinced, and it is truly because they borrowed their models from physics and like a bit of general relativity, or not, or Newtonian physics actually. um and they like, since their economics are so grounded in this like imitation of Newtonian physics, they so genuinely believe that economics is a physical representation of like the subjective,
Yeah.
when it is absolutely not. um but oh my god, when you were talking about how like these very niche genders find themselves like invisible under like a guise of capital, like it's so fascinating, because there was this like there was this sort of paper that I was thinking of writing up about hyperpop, this like genre that's like really new um in a lot of different ways, but like doesn't really have like any static definitions regarding the way that it expresses itself as a community or even as like a genre of music. And it finds a way to, in a very similar way, like hide itself from the musical standard. And like um some people will like listen to it ironically and some people will listen to it quite seriously, and like it becomes a point of like I guess I'd use the word post irony, that like there is no way to throw capital at it, for instance, or that kind of like mundane musical standard that is applied to something like classical music or a lot of like stuff embedded into Western culture of music. Like I find that to be like a really similar phenomenon. Like because it's so new and niche as a musical community that like they they just they just hide in plain sight, like in this really weird cultural sense.
Yeah, it seems like it's similar in the sense that like if you can't judge it by the standards that you would judge like a major like genre of music from
Yeah,
and expect to understand it. Like, am I right about that?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think the
that's a
same
way
is
better
true
way to
of
put
the
that.
xenogenders.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. I think like I think what I love so much about like hyperpop and xenogenders and stuff like neopronouns is that they're like fundamentally like anti-cultural in a sort of sense. Like they are the active dissenting factors within like a traditional culture or a status quo. And hopefully they tend to like just stay that way. Um because like at the end of the day they like at the end of the day if their qualities just remain like I guess amorphous and like decentral or naughty or dynamic, like yeah, like if they stayed away from a way that like I guess capital could get its hands around, or even some other thing that like determines something as a status quo or like a major popularizing kind of phenomenon, um, you could just like you could finally find a way to permanently anonymize yourself from the the uh the traditions that I don't have the words to properly express what these traditions are. Um, these traditions that try to fit you in a box. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. There are always these byproducts that come out of societies that
Hmm.
kind of escape their terms. Like there's always openings like that and
Yeah.
strange things that get created and come out and kind of exist outside of a lot of the world's like ways of conceiving and perceiving. So like I don't know, like I don't think like I'm not like a vulgar left com who would say like oh everything is just capital, like everything is just captured by
Right.
capital. Like there's always weird stuff that happens and the world is kind of more there's more possibilities and potentialities than that for me.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of
Oh,
people who are like far left, like communists, like, and they're into philosophy, they kind of end up falling into a category where they just end up thinking that everything is hopeless. But
mhm.
I don't really share that view.
I definitely don't share that view either. Like I definitely agree with that. Um, I think that there are many things that escape this kind of, because fundamentally, like as much as Marxists want to think as much, or any sort of communist that kind of succeeded Marxism, like as much as they want to think as much, they still are creating boxes um, to fit people in, and it's like there are plenty of things within this world that will not fit in those categories, that don't work with the image that is given. uh and I can't really say anything else other than like, well, I could say more. Like it's like when I contrast, for instance, Marxism and a lot of its traditions to I guess I guess Nietzsche and in some ways a lot of existentialists, it's a matter of like understanding that Marxism down to its core wants to be a religion, or sorry, wants to be a science, sorry, wants to be a science, but is in fact a religion, um, according to existentialists. Like, at the end of the day, they have created a mythos, whether they want to acknowledge it or not. They have designed themselves something to, and this goes a little bit to Aristotle, like something to praise instead of celebrate, which in my mind is kind of like, I think that thing that they praise is either the proletariat or their hatred for capital. Um, one or the other, but could be both. Either way, they are they design a sort of thing that is religious in structure, especially according to Nietzsche, and I would say any existentialist that has succeeded him would probably agree. Maybe not Sartre, but yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't really like. I find a lot of times when people make that critique from that angle of saying like, "Oh, Marxism is just a new kind of religious force."
Mhm.
I oftentimes it's made in a way that makes no sense to me. Like it's just kind of
Yeah.
they're just saying like, "Oh, they just want you to conform," and like, but I feel like if you're really a Marxist, you don't have this kind of Anglo view of categories. Like you see all categories as dialectical. So everything is
Mhm.
kind of like in other things and like in itself different from itself, but also
Right.
still itself. Like this kind of like the world is dialectical if you're really a Marxist. Like
Mhm. Yeah. Um, yeah. With regards to the uh, the dialectic, especially like the kind of like material dialectic that Marxists deal with, it's like they're oh man, my my ADHD has me forgetting the point I was gonna make. Oh, um, shoot. It, um, because with regard to I guess coming from an ontological perspective, I guess it's important. There is a title of a Sartrean essay actually. I think it's Sartre, maybe it's someone else who it's quite literally it's like the problem of seeing Marxism as an ontology as opposed to a what's the word not a pragmatism but like as a critical analysis um like Marxism is a tool, Marxism is a science when you boil it down to its best features. It isn't to say that I think like I might have said this like offhandedly and without considering the implications. I wouldn't call Marxism like fundamentally a religion. But I would say that Marxists in many ways treat the science of Marxism and in some ways this very ideological kind of monster that's grown from the science of Marxism into, or they treat it as a religion. So perhaps I meant the converse of what I just said. Um, because like, yeah, I wouldn't, because this is just a personal issue with me. I wouldn't accept like the dialectical materialism to be ontologically the case. Given that I'm kind of just like I'm an existentialist, a phenomenologist. Like there are all these situations where I place myself where like I place my philosophy starting with where my my experience begins, like just the I, um, especially with phenomenology. But like it, we return to a lot of old philosophical problems when we start treating Marxism like a philosophy as opposed to a critical science or a tool that is used upon economics and politics. I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but I think that was the point I was trying to make. Um,
Yeah, for me, I don't think there's much of a difference between Marxism philosophically and as a political tool. Like,
hmm,
they kind of go hand in hand. It kind of goes hand in hand with itself. But I'm not really like a header or like a orthodox, like dogmatic Marxist either. I'm not
oh,
really that way about anything, honestly. Like,
yeah, yeah.
so I
I,
will
I
take
didn't.
from all kinds of different areas, and like I just take what I like and I leave what I don't, kind of thing.
Yeah, I was like, I wouldn't like. Or rather, I didn't. I guess expect you to be.
Yeah.
Um, I think. Yeah, like it's just the sort of thing that I observe and kind of criticize all the time. Like, because you just find people who are dogmatic in ways that don't work. Um, and I guess the reason why I'm like, yeah, Marxism is more of a science than a philosophy kind of comes more so from like recent readings I've had with Laurel, by which I'm like,
Hmm.
Marxism doesn't really treat the world with a double transcendence and stuff like that. Um,
I mean,
but it deals with like it deals. Go ahead.
I think that this kind of changes the subject a little bit, but for me,
Yeah.
non-Marxist like left liberalism is more of a
Mhm.
religious phenomenon. That's like
Oh yeah.
it poses itself as political, but it's actually like a kind of cultural, social, like people sublimating their religious drives as
Right.
people into a kind of conformity.
Yeah. Without a doubt. Like I would 100% agree with you. Like when it comes to political theories about the world, Marxism is one of the few that comes the closest to not being subjected to by people who want to see it as a religion is how I'd specifically put it.
Yeah.
Um but then like the only reason why I kind of like step opposed to Marxism in this one nuanced way, which isn't to say I even oppose Marxism, I just oppose self-proclaimed Marxists is again more specific. The only reason why I find that to be that's okay. I find that to be a problem about Marxism because it leaves itself open in that way. Um, and the reason why I'm definite with that stance against it is because like I find myself to think there are other philosophies that can bring like perhaps something better, a better criticism that's kind of on the horizon, or so I hope. Um,
Hmm.
but that's kind of me being an optimist. Other than that, Marxism, at least in very unorthodox ways that it is used, is extremely helpful. Like I use it myself all the time.
Yeah, totally.
Mm. And I know that we've like gone way off the topic. Like I hope you don't mind about that.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm not even sure. Like, do you have anything else to say about the neopronouns thing?
Um, with neopronouns, um, yeah, like the last thing that I wanted to say was kind of just, um, yeah, like neopronouns are an example of something that creates new cultural tools and grounds tradition in reality. Um, which is to say, it grounds tradition in the present, more specifically. Um, yeah, that's my all encompassing conclusion because it's like that kind of makes its steps against the whole dogmatism about the binary and also the lack of professionalism regarding the grammatical rules of pronouns, because those were the only real problems I had in the first place. I thought I had more when I was like listening, but honestly, it's just those two.
All right. Well, I mean, what you've said so far is good. Like, I definitely wish that I could get you two to kind of clash live, like to see what
Yeah.
would happen. Like, I don't know. I've been thinking of like I want to do like some kind of panel sometime where
Hmm.
I get like a lot of people I know with different kind of political and philosophical perspectives into like a big call. And like, would you be interested in that? Because
Well, I'd definitely be interested in that. That
all
sounds
right,
really
cool.
awesome.
Yeah. I kind of want to throw something like that together soon if people are
Hmm.
interested. So maybe you will both be in the same call and be able to hash it out like in
Yeah,
live terms.
be a lot of fun. I think. I'd definitely be up for that. Just let me know like when you might want to have it, because like my schedule tends to be like an ass to me a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's understandable. Okay.
um, but other than that, yeah, I think um, is that like all you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to bring up. I'm kind of glad that we had like the little extra tangents too, because like
Yeah, it was
it,
definitely a good conversation.
yeah,
I'll see you later.
yeah. Let's see.
Okay, great. That was good, I think, folks. I don't know how much else I'm gonna do today other than that. It might just be a short one.